In this video, we're going to start talking about the topic of bioenergetics. And bioenergetics is just a fancy word for Legos. And essentially what it is it's talking about living systems, and how they produce energy and use energy for activities for survival. And so when we're talking about bioenergetics, really all I want you to think about is Legos, right? When we have Legos, we can either build new things with those Legos, or we can tear them down to get the pieces that we want or that we need. And that's what your body is essentially doing. Now, the big term associated with bioenergetics is metabolism or metabolic reactions. And what metabolism is just these processes of building and breaking down these new compounds. And there are two types. We have what we call anabolic reactions, and we have catabolic reactions. Anabolic reactions, if you've ever heard of anabolic steroids, it's the same root word. And what it means is you have a series of parts, and you build them into something more complicated or bigger of a structure. That's an anabolic reaction. So now I have a new structure. An example of this in your body would be when you have an adenosine and 3 inorganic phosphate groups, and you build them together to create ATP. That would be an anabolic reaction. A catabolic reaction would be when you already have a large structure, you already have something built, and you need those parts, or you need to break it down to get something out of it. And so you could break that structure down into its individual pieces or into a smaller piece. A simple way of remembering catabolic is if you think about a cannibal, right? It's a pretty similar word. A cannibal is someone who breaks people down into smaller parts. And so that's one way of remembering it. Now, when we're looking at your metabolism, we say that you are either in an anabolic state or a catabolic state based on the total sum of the reactions in your body. So for example, if you had 100 catabolic reactions and 200 anabolic reactions, we would say that you're in an anabolic state because you're building more than you're breaking down. On the flip side, if you were breaking more down than you were building, we would say you're in a catabolic state. Now, where does this come into play? If you think about exercise or physical activity, what's happening is you're creating energy, you're breaking down energy, the muscle tissues in your body are breaking down, right? You are creating more damage, you're breaking more tissues and structures down than you're actually building. So that's why you get tired, and that's why you get some muscular damage associated with physical activity, because of this catabolic reactions, because you're breaking things down. So when you exercise, you're in a catabolic state. Well, if you remember when we were talking about the principle of rest and recovery, we said that rest and recovery is essential to enhancing performance, and that's when you actually see a lot of these changes and these adaptations. Some of the adaptations we're referring to are anabolic reactions. So making your muscle bigger and stronger, you have to build those physical fibers using your proteins and your amino acids. And so rest and recovery is what we call a anabolic state, right? Because you're building more of those structures. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Now, if you remember, we have one adenosine group, we have 3 inorganic phosphate groups, and they have chemical bonds in between them. So when your body needs a muscle to contract, you have to break this 3rd chemical bond to produce energy so that you can actually get that muscular contraction. So by breaking this bond and releasing this, it gives off energy. Now, your body is not perfectly efficient, and so when it breaks that bond to create energy, about 40 to 50% of the energy is actually wasted and lost as heat. And so that's why when you start exercising, your body starts to produce heat, you start sweating, you have to dissipate that heat because you're starting to get some of that heat from these reactions. So the more ATP you're breaking down, the more heat you are producing. That's why at low levels of activity, you really don't sweat, like if you're walking to your car. But when you're doing a HIIT style workout, you sweat a lot because you're having a lot of these muscular contractions. Now, let's go into a little bit more detail about the process of breaking down this 3rd group. So you have a chemical bond here, you want to break it. For this to happen, you need to do a process called hydrolysis. And hydrolysis has 2 parts, right? Hydro, meaning water, and then lysis means to break down. So if you ever see lysis, we're talking about a catabolic reaction where we're taking something big and we're breaking it down. So what we're doing is we're using a water molecule as well as what we'll call an enzyme, and we'll explain what that means here in a second, to break this chemical bond to release that energy. And so when you're doing this, you need an enzyme or a helper. And think of the enzyme, and I use this analogy a lot, but if we're talking about a recipe, right, we have ATP, we have some water, right? That's our recipe, those are our ingredients, and we want to make ADP, and we want to break that bond. Well, we need a chef or we need a helper to carry out that recipe. And so how I like to think about enzymes is I like to think about them as the helper that facilitates that reaction. And so when you're breaking your third bond through hydrolysis, you have an enzyme called ATPase. Okay? And ATPase is an enzyme that helps facilitate that reaction. One way you know something is an enzyme is if it ends in ASE. 9 out of 10 times if you see ASE at the end of that word, we're talking about an enzyme, we're talking about something that is facilitating either building or breaking down, right? Because we need enzymes for both anabolic and catabolic reactions. And so if we're talking ATP, we're talking about breaking this down, we have that water present, we have ATPase, we can break this bond and we can actually create that energy.